Okay, so good morning, everybody. I think it's still morning. We haven't transitioned to afternoon yet. Well, I'd like to thank Samuel and everybody from the team who has made this event a success, and for everybody for coming. It's really nice. So I'm not going to take much of your time because we have something else to move on to in the panel discussion. I'm going to talk about perspectives. Perspectives as the mother of all insecurities. This paper was inspired by the cliche question, how can we stop conflict? And I was asking myself, thinking, how can we do that? And I just realized we cannot really stop conflict because we do not have total control over our perspectives. However, we can at least try and manage them. So this is what we're going to look at today. I'm going to start out by just giving a general overview of what is perspectives and how we create our perspectives. Then I'm going to show the work which has been done already in political science around this issue. And then I'm going to show that the same type of thought is there in Africa, in the philosophy of Ubuntu. And then afterwards, I'm just going to just argue why I think if we follow using these philosophies, these ways of doing things, we can create a much safer society. Right, so first of all, what is perspective? Perspective is the way that we're able to just build up our own opinions based on a number of factors. These factors don't necessarily have to be true. They don't have to be the right representation, but they create the way we frame our mind, the way we understand the world, and then of course they create the attitudes. Then we have the attitudes of behavior, and then of course we have a point of view. So as an African, I have an African perspective. So factors which contribute to the way I think and do things are influenced by my foundation, my input. It doesn't necessarily mean the factors that I have are good for me or the factors that I have are the best, but they simply construct the way I see the world. Perspective is a process. Now it gets more complicated. It's a process, not two people see the same thing in the same way. So which means we cannot have a system, a defined one. We have psychologists, psychiatrists, but they will never tell you that each patient is the same. So it's a very complicated process which we cannot manage, which we have no control over, because it also is a process of processes whereby you have to acquire the information, where you have to analyze the data and interpret it within your whole sphere, remembering that these factors may both be positive or negative. So it is really, really a challenge just to manage this on a process level. So the dynamics of perspective are also influenced by the fact that philosophy, schools of thought that we have in our communities determine the way we think, determine the way we see the world. So what is your philosophy? We have Western ideologies, right? Political science is a Western concept, and then of course we have concepts in Africa. All of those things influence the way you see things generally. And then of course ethnocentrism, right? Once you have this philosophy, this way of understanding, you then start to judge or to view the world from that same point. You use your own knowledge to be able to draw conclusions about what's going on. So it always comes back to what do you have within you in order for you to interpret the world, in order for you to engage with the world, and then make decisions. And then of course we have the evolution in the affairs of man. Man has been changing. So we change the way we live our lives, which means in a way we change the way we think. So which means it's continuous. We can't put a lid on it because it's a continuous process. Thinking is a continuous process. That is if people think, right? Mm-hmm. And then of course we have institutions and stuff like that. But because from this very base, the fact that we generate our understanding differently, we have no control over this process, and we will never have the same way of viewing things, not at least 100%, it means conflict and strife are inevitable. So we fight just because we don't understand. They are innate in us, but we can at least manage them. We can use platforms such as philosophies, such as some standards, to manage this condition we have, which is the condition of individuality. As long as we're individuals, as long as we're human beings, we will always act and behave differently. So we can manage it as a condition, the same way we manage cancer or any other conditions. Right, in political science, they are aware of this. Then they started investigating. How can we use identity politics? How can we bring in this element of individuality into our study? How can we sort of try and make it easier to interpret, and then maybe we can be able to manage? But generally, there are lots of definitions. So which means within political science field, there is no agreement on anything. What is identity? If somebody asked me last week, Professor, what are the stereotypes associated with Zimbabweans? And I said I cannot identify as a Zimbabwean. And she was surprised because to me it was like a very, what is to be Zimbabwean? To be Zimbabwean to me means I have to be Shona, but I'm not Shona, I'm Ndebele, therefore I cannot answer as a Zimbabwean because I identify as a Ndebele, but my documents say I'm Zimbabwean. So who am I? So first of all, I couldn't answer that question because my identity, the way I perceive it, is different based on my own perspective of what it means to be Zimbabwean. And from her point of view, she was asking a very simple question. So we have one of those issues. And then, of course, political science tries to class things. When you start classing things, it's great, it's manageable, but you're creating a frame which does not accommodate everybody. So then we have different aggregations, we have aggregations on power, we have aggregations on hierarchy, all of those things. But do they really mean much? Do we understand power in the same way? Like earlier on, my colleague said Zimbabwe is poor. And I said, no, Zimbabwe is not poor, it's impoverished. I'm not poor as a Zimbabwean because I have resources, I can think, I have life, I have resources like mineral resources. But I'm impoverished by poor government policy. So that does not mean I'm poor. But you're right in a sense, if I don't have food, if transport right now in Zimbabwe is over $2, that's poverty, right? So, but then you see, we're talking about the same thing, but we can choose to call it or view it in different ways because we are just inherently different. So, of course, what influences our thoughts are the studies in political science, it's the international relations itself, the changing landscape, the social groups that we come from, and of course our political leaders. There's a lot of consciousness in Southern Africa because of Nelson Mandela. He was a phenomenal leader who brought about change in the system by changing the way people saw themselves. No, you're human beings. We can stand up against apartheid and then we can be liberated. That is a political leader and how they influence the way we see things. But anyway, this is not new. I'm not saying anything which is new. This is the whole point. We know what's going on. Therefore, we need to use the right solutions. So, to balance it off, we start out by looking at Kant's categorical imperative. Kant is a philosopher, a Western philosopher. And he came up with this idea that, you know, human beings are rational. They can think, they can be able to make decisions on their own, but they just need to be guided in a way. So he's right. So we need some form of guidance. And he argues that we can only know a thing by experience. It's always like a phenomenon for us. Like a glass is a glass, but for me to really know what the value of a glass, probably when I touch it, when I drink from it, that's when I will really know what a glass is. And then of course, all of these things are derived through sense, and external factors influence how we come to our conclusions, but also internal factors, the subjectivity of human beings. So he proposed that each person is a self-legislating person, meaning each person has rights within themselves and they can exercise those rights. And then of course, this person can also understand that there are other people in different parts. So which means he is not only naive of him being there, but he's aware of principle of universality. So in this universality, he emphasizes the golden rule, which I think is famously said by Jesus, do unto others as you have them do unto you. Yes, of course. Act in the way you would want other people to act towards you. If we start behaving that way, if you bomb Syria, would you like Syrians to bomb you as Russia? If you embezzle funds, would you want to be embezzled yourself? If we start thinking from that basic, yes. And then of course, the rule becomes universal, a universal moral law if we are all able to practice it equally and willingly. And then the most important thing, to treat people as an end, not as a means. And this is the issue with African politics. Most Africans are treated as a means. We're exploited by the investors, we're exploited by the governments. We exploit each other as Africans. Nobody identifies, well, maybe nobody's an over-exaggeration, but generally, people don't realize that every person is valuable and are in end not some tool to be used. This is where the whole problem begins. But this is not a new thought. We also think like that in Africa, like Kant, with the philosophy of Ubuntu. Ubuntu, it means I am because we are, you know, humanity towards others. The universality principle comes back. So I cannot say, oh, the actions I do as Zimbabwe don't have an impact in Belarus. We can all see that they have impact when we look at climate change issues. What we do in our countries, or what the Western world has done during industrialization, the effects are now being felt by the less developed countries who don't even have these infrastructures. So we are definitely bound together. And Ubuntu raises the consciousness towards respect for self and respect for others, which means we get back to this self-legislation ability. So you can't be human all by yourself, but we can be human all together. So what are the similarities with when we look at Ubuntu and we compare Ubuntu with Kant? We can see that both philosophies recognize the individuality and the ability to self-legislate that human beings have, and both philosophies agree that human beings are rational beings. They can deduct and think. Then may not be the smartest all the time, but people generally think. And then, of course, people are an end in themselves. They're not tools to be used. So we have two schools sharing the similar concept from different parts of the world. So we are all rational beings. We're universally moral. So all of these things work together. But how can we then use this idealistic, this vision to make life better? Yes, we can. First of all, as an African scholar, do not treat Africa or Africans as a means. We are an end in ourselves. We have identities, we have feelings, we have homes, we have ambitions. So first of all, we need to move away from the exploitation of Africa and African resources by the international community, and the internal community, which is our governments, our business investors, all of those people, because the effects are long term. Right now, we still have the effects of colonization in Africa, whereby Africans don't think freely because we are still mentally colonized, because the system of function within the government is still colonial based. We have some countries still paying colonial tax to France, which is the most ridiculous thing, and all those things. The impacts are really long term. And the sad thing is, Africans ourselves, we have been so down in the mud that we start to believe that there's no hope for ourselves. And so now we have this way of thinking, this perspective of, oh, we're Africans, we're poor, we're sad. How will we change? How will economic development come? And the thing is, this is happening. We have China now in Africa doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But we need to stop treating Africa or African resources as just a means and recognize that we're an end. And this goes not only to the international community, but especially to our leadership, our governments in power right now. But just in a way to sum up, because I only have 15 minutes and I have time for a few questions, maybe after the break. But generally, first of all, our international partners, when you come to Africa, have a consciousness that Africa and Africans are a means, an end in themselves, not a means. Then that way we can create better relations. Better relations mean we will reduce the propensity to war. It's all a collective effort thing. And then, of course, this is a new era. This is the fourth wave. Do we really need to do things the way we've been doing them all along? Do we really need to exploit each other in the same dynamics as we were doing before? This is a new game, a new playing field. And Africans want to step up. And so you find that you may go with the intention to exploit, and then you are, in a sense, eroding your own potential, because if you came in and recognized that these people are in hand and you can work with them, we could build better global systems. It would be much better if it was peaceful. I would really like to go to Congo and feel safe. I would like to go to Egypt on holiday and feel safe. But we do not have that on an African platform because we're treated as a means and not an end. So my argument is, We fight because we see things differently, and we cannot change that. But we can at least manage it by following certain principles that help create some form of common standards and responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, this is me for today. Thank you.